With Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth on the anchor desk here at America's Forum, we're continuing to follow the developing story, the shocking story this morning of the Germanwings plane crash in the French Alps a couple of days ago. We can tell you that this news broke earlier this morning. According to prosecutors, the co-pilot in the aircraft was German-born 28-year-old Andreas Lubitz.
Yes, we're being told that he allegedly made a deliberate attempt to crash that plane. Again, that's 8320. That's the flight. There were 3 Americans on board. There are about 18 different countries that were being represented on that flight. Prosecutor Bryce Robbins says as of now, there's nothing that indicates that this was a terrorist attack. And we're also hearing reports that people that knew this co-pilot said that he showed no signs of depression or any suicidal thoughts. Of course, there's still, everything is speculative.
As we get this information, it leads to more speculation. There's nothing to speculate about the death toll. Everyone on board that plane perished, and we understand the co-pilot was alive until impact, so there was no health problem. Lufthansa, the parent airline of its economy division Germanwings, has characterized this crash as an accident.
Yeah, and we broke in earlier to talk with aviation safety expert Keith Cianfrani. Here's a piece of that interview.
You're joined via telephone by Keith Cianfrani from Aviation Safety Consultants. He's phoning in from Doylestown, Pennsylvania. Keith, we are hearing now from French authorities that it is believed the co-pilot of that Germanwings jet deliberately locked out the pilot. We have an identity on that co-pilot. He is identified as 28-year-old Andreas Lubitz. As you hear the information this morning with the rest of us, Keith, your reaction from your vantage point as one who has spent some time in the cockpit.
Well, I would say that really didn't surprise me. I did a few interviews yesterday, and I was saying that something catastrophic had to happen inside the aircraft or the cockpit to enable it to descend rapidly, whether it was some sort of explosive device or basically pilot-induced or co-pilot-induced. Those aircraft are very sophisticated. The Airbus, they make good aircraft, and for the aircraft to descend that quickly, there's only 2 reasons why you descend in that manner. One is you have a rapid decompression, and that's a rapid descent, and then if you lose an engine, it's a slow descent. But that type of descent, to me, initially when I saw it, looked like something else had to be taking place inside the cockpit, and possibly a terrorist act.
Keith, and there's been a lot of talk this morning, actually going into late last evening, talking about some of the differences in regulations here in the U.S. when it comes to flying versus overseas. Can you talk about that a little bit? Specifically,
access to the flight deck.
Right.
The fact that 2 people in the United States must be on the flight deck at all times. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, and that's a procedure that U.S. companies follow, where if one of the crew members in the cockpit leaves, then they have to have another one in there at all times until that individual comes back. When they exchange the codes or the combination to get in, somebody else goes in, kind of trying to prevent something like this from happening. The other thing, too, is that was relatively a short time after takeoff that the captain had left, and I know there's policies with a lot of airlines where they'll try to stay in there as long as possible and make the exits outside the cockpit as minimal as possible. So that kind of alarmed me a little bit too. Is that I was only 30 minutes or so. Why the pilot felt the need to get up and leave the cockpit at that time, unless there was something going on that he had to take care of.
And of course, with these revelations, Keith, sadly, it opens the door to even more speculation. The fact that this young co-pilot is basically being named as the suspect or the perpetrator in, you mentioned the word terrorism, some might say suicide by aircraft, really mass murder, but a deliberate act here. And that leads to another question, and that is personnel in the cockpit. By that I mean flight crews. With airlines, just how familiar are pilots with one another? Is it kind of a hit or miss, happening to know an acquaintance who flies along with you, or do you know anything about the policies of...
Well, let's just back up and look at the background checks. Normally there are extensive background checks for pilots. This was a young guy. I think I saw about 600 hours. In my opinion, it was relatively low hours for a co-pilot flying this type of aircraft. Very young. Doesn't seem to have that much experience. But when they do background checks, it's very thorough. But again, a lot of countries are very sensitive to religion, so they don't go that far into it, to tell you the truth. But when you're flying on the line like that, you don't really fly with the same person all the time. So there may be some times where you pick up a flight that you've never flown with that individual before, and there's sometimes that you may fly with the individual several times a month. So it's just really how the schedule picks itself and how they assign flights to different crew members. So the pilot may not know the other pilot, and even if he did know him, you don't really know what the motivation is at all times. So it's kind of a random thing.
Keith, what are some of the questions that you have watching all of this unfold?
Well, like I said from yesterday, something did not feel right to me. Planes just don't fall out of the sky, especially those type of aircraft. So something had to happen. It's very disturbing to me that this deliberate act that cost the lives of all these people. I still think the industry is very safe. These things happen now and then, but it's hard to prevent. Maybe some further screening will go into some of these types of airlines. But it is very disturbing. If something happens and it's a mechanical thing or if it's a human error factor, that's one thing we can go and correct it and do an investigation and come up with some recommendations on how to prevent it again. But these type of things are very hard to look at and try to predict what's going to happen.
Our thanks to Keith Cianfrani, who joined us earlier this morning as we broke into regular programming with this very disturbing story.
Yeah, we're finding out some new information about that co-pilot. We've heard new reports. This is coming in from the New York Times saying since September that the co-pilot had been with Germanwings since September 2013 and had 630 hours of flight experience. A lot of people have been questioning his mental state during that flight. We've heard other reports coming in from the Associated Press that this gentleman had no particular history of any kind of mental illness, suicidal thoughts. Those who knew him said never showed any signs of depression.
We are caught in a situation where we're trying to make sense out of the senseless.
Right.
And for more perspective on this, let's go back to Newsmax LA, our good friend contributor, Larry Elder, for his thoughts. Larry?
Well, Miranda and JD, listening to all of this, I'm not sure whether or not it's better or worse that the guy's had some sort of mental problems or might have been inspired by Islamic extremism. He appears to be a perfectly good guy, perfectly healthy guy. Nobody said anything negative about him. That's almost more frightening to me. The other thought is, after 9/11, we hardened the doors so that the passengers could not get into the cockpit. The idea was that the pilot needed to be protected from the passengers, not the other way around.
Right.
And so it sets up another situation. What happens to correct the correction, in essence, that was made? We spoke about it some with Keith Cianfrani, and obviously, Larry, you raise another interesting question. Lots more that we question about this story, a lot more to monitor with developments. We'll continue to do so as America's Forum continues here on Newsmax TV.